Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Elisa, go for it.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Welcome this afternoon. We appreciate your being with us in your busy schedules. My name is Elisa Orent. I'm the program manager from the CCAR. Welcome to the third webinar in a series on this important topic. As a reminder, this program is being recorded, as were the previous ones, and they will be available through your respective organizations. I also want to let you know that you have the ability to send in questions on the chat tab on the right-hand side. The Central Conference of American Rabbis is thrilled to be able to co-sponsor this important series and to have representation from the Reform Rabbinic leadership. I am extremely delighted to introduce to you Eric Ward today, who will be speaking on the topic of anti-Semitism and white nationalism. Eric Ward is the Executive Director of Western States Center, which is a research, organizing, training, and civic engagement hub for grassroots leaders from diverse communities in the United States, Pacific Northwest, and Intermountain West regions. He has a long and distinguished career as a social justice advocate, working for many decades with the entire country, national organizations, to help implement strategies for change around racial justice and immigrant rights. We are exceptionally happy to have you with us today, Eric, and we look forward to learning from you this afternoon.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone on the call. Apologies for not having a visual here. I'm having a little technical difficulties while in the road. Today, I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the state of anti-Semitism in America, what that means for civil society, but also our communities and civic space. It is important for us to understand that it has been a little over 2 years since the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where one person was murdered, 2 law enforcement officers were killed in a related accident, and 5 people were seriously injured. It is a little over a year since the white nationalist attack on the Tree of Life, a Jewish congregation in Pittsburgh, where 11 people were murdered and 7 injured. It is a little over 6 months since one person was murdered and 3 others injured by a white nationalist at the Jewish congregation in Poway, California, and a little over 3 months since a white nationalist killed himself and wounded 17 people, murdered 3 in Gilroy, California, and just a little over 2 months since the white nationalist attack on a mostly Latino crowd in El Paso, where 22 people were killed and 24 injured. In fact, over the last 2 years, over 100 Americans have been murdered at the hands of white nationalists in the United States. If that type of terror targeting were occurring anywhere outside of the United States, we would be calling it a pandemic. It is significant, but I want us to understand that even beyond the physical violence, there are other signs of an increase in white nationalist activity. It is not merely happening through violence, but also at the ballot box, reshaping the very public narratives that we have as a society. Western State Center and others over the last decades have consistently tracked white nationalist and white nationalist aligned candidates running for public office. It has been rare over the last 3 decades that we have seen more than 40 individuals who have run for public office. But in the last electoral cycle, in 2018, that changed. What we saw for the first time were over 350 white nationalist and white nationalist aligned candidates who declared themselves for public office, from the local level to the national level. Now, the majority, and I should say the far majority of those candidates never made it out of their primaries or lost significantly in their election campaigns. But we should note that in the majority of cases, most of these individuals, either in the primary or their run, garnered more than 10% of the vote. That is significant in any type of electoral analysis. We are in a moment right now where we find ourselves as a nation debating what it means to be an American and what will America look like. That debate is being driven by demographic anxiety, growing economic inequality, and the increasingly siloed space that traditional human rights and civil rights organizations have found themselves in, alienated from the American population, focused on myopic debates within the community, rather than larger conversations around the American narrative. While many are in shock following this violence by the white nationalist movement, many communities have understood that the violence and the electoral activity expresses an underlying conflict over inclusion and opportunity in America. What I want to do in the moments that I have with you today is to talk a little bit about this moment and the role that anti-Semitism plays. At Western State Center, we believe that anti-Semitism is the paper upon which this debate is being argued and fought out. But because of the lack of American understanding of anti-Semitism, we are missing critical clues that could allow us to guide this conversation back to a unifying idea of American identity. First, I want to talk about where we are. From most reporting from the Department of Justice to the Southern Poverty Law Center to the Anti-Defamation League, we understand that anti-Semitism, or the reporting of anti-Semitism, is on the rise. We also understand, both through data and through media analysis, that there is an increasing number of physical attacks on those who are perceived or who are Jewish. That is unique in the historical pattern of anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States. Typically, the majority of anti-Semitic acts target institutions such as cemeteries, congregations, or other physical memorial sites. This recent uptick in physical attacks on members of the Jewish community themselves suggests an underlying evolution of anti-Semitism in America. How did we get here? To understand how we got here, we need to start by going back in time. What I want to do right now is to distinguish between the historical notion of white supremacy and the social movement I am discussing right now called white nationalism. What I'm saying is that we make a mistake of conflating white supremacy with white nationalism. When I talk about white supremacy, what I mean is a historical system that was designed in the Americas, that was based off the stolen resources of Native people, the exploited labor of African Americans through the slave trade, and through the control of women's sexuality. It is in part how our society socialized itself and evolved into what we know as the United States of America. That system still exists in a sense of historical and present day discriminatory patterns that many of us on this call and many of the organizations we are aligned with struggle to improve every day. White supremacy meets its biggest foe in the face of the 1960s civil rights movement. The 1960s civil rights movement was largely driven by African Americans from the South. This movement, while we often don't acknowledge it, was extremely successful at defeating white supremacy as the rule of law. What I mean by this is that previous to the civil rights movement, white supremacy was not a debated concept. It was resisted, but the majority of Americans simply saw that that was how life was, that people were superior or inferior simply based on skin color. The civil rights movement successfully challenged that notion and shifted white supremacy from being de jure, the rule of law, to de facto, a contested space. Now imagine that you are a person who believes in Jim Crow. You believe in separate but equal. You believe that Black people are inferior based off of their skin color. How then do you explain that people you perceive to be inferior defeated you in one of the most significant political fights in US history? Do you all of a sudden just say, well, I guess I was wrong. Black people aren't as inferior as I thought? Not likely. And it was in that defeat that arch segregationists and those who believed in Jim Crow sought another answer to their political defeat. And what they borrowed from was an ideology that had existed in Europe, and it was called anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a form of anti-Jewish bigotry, and it was based, or at least canonized, around a false narrative called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a document that appears somewhere between the late 1800s and early 1900s. It is distributed by Russian secret police in France in the midst of the Dreyfus affair, where a young Jewish military officer who had converted to Christianity was put on trial and as a traitor to French democracy. And the argument and the narrative was that somehow Dreyfus was so powerful that eventually Jewish was secretly infiltrating French society and putting it intentionally into chaos. Dreyfus was later exonerated, and I think that that is an important point. But the Protocols of the Elders of Zion created a powerful narrative, the idea of a secret Jewish conspiracy and cabal that was seeking to take control of media, entertainment, finance, and other levers of power in order to oppress or to destroy European Christendom. The narrative was so powerful that eventually Russia brought it back in the midst of their own crisis, and Russia brought it back in the midst of it was that form that landed in the hands of Henry Ford, the inventor, one of the inventors of the US automobile. Henry Ford rescripted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion into a new essay called The International Jew, and distributed chapter by chapter through his own independent newspaper that was sold out of Ford dealerships around the country. This narrative was so powerful that Nazi Germany, during its short reign, published at least 24 editions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It is a powerful narrative that continues to drive anti-Semitism to this day. Those who had suffered the defeat at the hands of the civil rights movement leaned into the protocols. Some had been exposed to it through Henry Ford, others as World War II GIs in Europe. For them, the protocols explained the loss to African Americans while allowing them to hold their anti-Black ideas intact. For them, the answer became not that they lost against African Americans in the moral sway of history, but that they lost to a Jewish conspiracy that used African Americans as puppets. I stop here now to make a point, which is this: that anti-Semitism is not only anti-Jewish, but it is also anti-Black in the modern context. And it is anti-Black in that it denies African Americans, and by extension, other people of color, agency over their own lives. Anti-Semitism cast a narrative that people of color no longer have legitimate grievances, but are merely puppets of a larger global Jewish conspiracy. It is that drive of the conspiracy, of the anti-Semitic conspiracy, that causes those who believe in segregation to create a new movement, a movement that becomes known as white nationalism. White nationalism doesn't seek to replace or go back to the days of Gone with the Wind, but instead seeks to overthrow the United States and the United States government to institute an all-white ethno-state. Simply put, if white supremacy is about a system of exploitation, white nationalism is a social movement that seeks to assume political power to rid people of color and Jews from the United States altogether. Where is the challenge today? Despite the increasing anti-Semitic violence in our country, despite the fact that white nationalists have proven themselves to have increasing influence in our society, those movements, and I mean specifically progressive left human rights and anti-racist organizations, have failed to appear on the scene. I believe some of the reasons or challenges that have prevented the human rights movement from mobilizing in this moment have to do with one. We try to understand anti-Semitism through every other lens except actual anti-Semitism. We often measure the validity of anti-Semitism by comparing it to other forms of bigotry like racism or homophobia or perhaps even Islamophobia. But the truth is that anti-Semitism is not simply about a system of exploitation. It is about an ideology that is inherently anti-democratic. It seeks to use Jews as a scapegoat and a cover, right, to increase totalitarian and authoritarian leaning principles in a society. Two, we also are challenged because we try to explain anti-Semitism through the lens of the 20th century rather than its role in 21st century America. What I mean by this, by way of a counterexample, is imagine if we only discussed or tried to understand anti-Black racism through the lens of 1800 America. Imagine if we only measured the threat of anti-Black racism in comparison to the wave of terror lynchings that occurred in the US from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. We would miss very critical data points in this moment. Third, we confuse experience with knowledge. And what I mean in this point is that because in the United States, many Jews individually have not experienced anti-Semitism as a behavior, the leap then becomes, well, then anti-Semitism must not be a problem in our society. But again, I want to reinforce that anti-Semitism is not merely a set of behaviors. It is an ideology that seeks to undermine the idea of universalism and democratic processes around centering people in accountable and transparent government. Finally, I believe one of the challenges for human rights organizations is that their concerns around Israel and Palestine have clouded their ability to understand the full scope and impact of anti-Semitism in the United States. I want to finish with this and just with some thoughts. It is important for us to understand that the way we address historical racial discrimination in the United States, white supremacy, are not the same tools that we would use to try to manage and isolate a white nationalist social movement. To conflate those tools or to conflate white supremacy with white nationalism is akin to comparing a Big Mac and a cow because they are both made out of beef. We do not call a veterinarian when one drops their Big Mac on the ground. Neither do we effectively respond to the white nationalist phenomena by borrowing from the tools that we use to address racial discrimination in our systems and our institutions. We are in a moment where we need to be able to address both. And we need to address them not only through our political voice, but also through the values and principles of what it means to be an American in this time and what our vision of a future America looks like. We not only need to express that vision of a future America, but we need to create spaces where we are practicing that future America. That means both addressing the systems of segregation that divide our communities from one another in daily life, but it also means drawing a clear moral barrier against bigotry, against this social movement that seeks to terrorize us and to divide us and to make us doubt the strength of democratic process. So thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Eric. Can folks hear me? This is Rabbi Elise Wechterman. I am the executive director of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, and I am honored to be on this call with you this afternoon. Thank you so much, Eric, for your analysis and your presentation. Some of us have heard bits of this before, but it is always helpful to hear the updated version given what we've experienced in this country in the past 2 years. I am looking to see some questions coming in, and I see some coming in. I'm going to start with one that I have for you. As you know, this is the third of a three-part series on anti-Semitism, and in all of them, the speakers, including yourself, have stressed how real and present the dangers are to our community from right-wing, white nationalist, white supremacy, and neo-Nazis in this country. We have also heard a bit about left-wing anti-Semitism as well, and I think you alluded to the challenge of looking at anti-Semitism with the complicating factors of Israel and Palestine in our midst. Can you share explicitly with us, Eric, your perspective on where the immediate danger to our community is coming from, and where our attention should most be focused?
Certainly, and thank you for that that question. And I want to say right before I answer, my job, my purpose is to complicate and nuance these discussions. I think they have been oversimplified in the debates that are happening in the real world. And so I'm really honored for this opportunity to kind of dive down. So I'm going to have everyone just take a big, deep breath before I weigh in. And I want to answer this question by first doing a little shift. I want to argue for a second that there isn't left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. In the same way that there's not left-wing racism or right-wing racism. There is anti-Semitism in American society, and it predates the rise of the white nationalist movement. It has existed for some time, as it has around the world. So if we can imagine this anti-Semitism just exists in our society, it is a powerful narrative, and I think we underestimate how powerful the narrative of anti-Semitism is. Now, we are dealing presently with two phenomena, and the phenomena are happening at the same time, which I think increases our alarm. And the two phenomena is that we have a white nationalist movement that is driven at its core by an anti-Semitic worldview. It believes it is in a battle, an existential battle, right, with this secret supposed Jewish cabal. But we're also dealing with anti-Semitism within the left. And the anti-Semitism in the left isn't core to the left, but the anti-Semitism in the left is both influential enough that it has prevented it from being able to effectively respond to this white nationalist phenomenon, right? It has immobilized the civil rights movement, the racial justice movement in this country, and that is deeply problematic. Now, while on the white nationalist end, white anti-Semitism is a conscious adoption, within the left, there are only small elements in which anti-Semitism is a conscious decision. For most elements within the political left, anti-Semitism exists because of a lack of understanding, like the rest of America, on the nature and the system of anti-Semitism, what it looks like and how it functions. And two, a stubbornness, right, that has chosen to interpret critiques around anti-Semitism as nothing more than a wedge assault from the political right. While it is true that anti-Semitism has been used in partisan ways, right, to attack leaders on the left, it is equally true that unchecked and unacknowledged anti-Semitism on the left absolutely exists and needs to be addressed. There is, I know there has been the question, and I'll end this way, around, well, is anti-Semitism as much of a concern on the left because they're not walking into congregations and opening fire, right? They're not physically, it hasn't led, or at least as we know, at least to physical attacks on the Jewish community, and therefore it's not as serious as anti-Semitism within white nationalist circles. I don't think that that is a sufficient answer. Because Black people aren't being lynched doesn't mean anti-Black racism in America isn't serious and needs attending to, or because the left doesn't intentionally dehumanize Black people, it doesn't mean racism in the left gets a pass, right? The way that I would suggest that we think about this is that the danger of anti-Semitism on the left is that it immobilizes the human and civil rights movement at a time when we need to be tightly aligned, right, and tightly in motion. And anti-Semitism has prevented that from happening.
Thank you. That is really very helpful, Eric. I'm going to combine two questions. Before I do that, I just want to remind people that there is a question box, a question area where you can put your questions in, and I will share them with Eric for as long as we have time. There are two questions that actually come to you in reflection from our webinar that many of us participated in yesterday, which was quite frightening and quite overwhelming about the neo-Nazi and white nationalist use of the dark web and their recruitment techniques. So one of the questions is, what can be done to work for regulation and fighting that in, let's say, official channels for trying to keep that out of the internet? And the other piece of it, which has to do with recruitment, is what can we do, or what can members of our communities do to help counter what seems to be an attractive narrative for young people, particularly teenagers, particularly young white men, I would say, from being drawn into this web from where they may sit as disaffected folks.
Yes. So it is true that the internet and technology has been used to fuel the ability of the white nationalist movement to coordinate, to attract new members, to recruit new members, and to spread its ideology. And quite frankly, even its intimidation at times. This is not unique. I want to be clear. It's not unique to the birth of the internet. We saw this during the rise of radio in the mass produced radio programming in the 1920s. And interesting enough, we saw this with the birth of the printing press. I think it is telling that in every new wave of a technological breakthrough, that there are individuals who have used those vehicles to spread anti-Semitism to a larger population than they would have normally been able to reach. Christian anti-Semites did that with the printing press. Authoritarian and fascist-leaning leaders, including Father Coughlin, Adolf Hitler, used radio. And in this day, the alt-right and white nationalist movement is using technology. I want to recognize the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, Color of Change, and Muslim advocates who have worked in coalition with one another to hold tech companies accountable. But here I am again to nuance, and I think that there is something we should consider. So I am, and we at Western State Center are, of course, as you can imagine, cautious around the criminalization of speech and expression. It is usually done in times of great fear and real legitimate fear, but the long-term results in a democratic society are not always so beneficial. And we do worry about the increased criminalization rather than the usage of laws and regulations that are already on the books. Two, as we understand this problem, it's not simply the use of the technological vehicles, but it's also the providers themselves, and I'm going to name them: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and a host of them, by way of a counterexample, that they have found a profit stream in controversy. So it only takes me 2 clicks when I go into YouTube to get to an alt-right or white nationalist entry point, right? And there is, by way of example, on Twitter, right, Linda Sassour, who folks know and have different views of. She and I have known each other a very, very long time. One of the things that I know about Linda is that she posts constantly on Twitter, right? She and I have followed each other on Twitter for over 7 years. The only time I see her post on Twitter are things that I would naturally disagree with, right, or dispute. Twitter, through its algorithms, wants me to engage and to stay on their platform. And what it understands is that I am more likely to engage and stay on that platform longer if I'm in a fight, right? If something has upset me or evoked an emotion. And it is time to hold these platforms accountable, right, for deriving profit off of controversy that leads to violence and political instability in American society. So that's one thing. Is imagine that I just want to make clear is that if we want to solve this problem, the solution lies in the younger generation that actually utilizes these tools, not with us adults, because the last thing we want to do are to become the parents who told their kids to shut off the radio and stop listening to that rock and roll music. I don't know about you, but it only made me want to listen to that music more, right? And so the answer has to come out of pure youth engagement. And that is a question around how much we are supporting young people, and I don't mean 30-year-olds, I mean actual young people who are on these platforms. How are we helping them strategize, and how are we helping them build the infrastructure that they need to do so?
Thank you. And I think that answers actually the second part of the question is how do we engage teens to keep them inoculated in some way from the attraction of some of these more extremist sites. And it sounds like what you might say is engagements and allowing them to find positive engagement and encouraging positive engagement among young people might be the way to go there. I'll stop and allow you to add more to that before I move on to the next question.
I think that's exactly right. I think that we are at a time in society where we are more connected than ever. Our ability through technology to share common experience has grown, but it has also created and brought with it a different type of alienation, right? An emotional alienation from one another that has enhanced not only generational segregation, but racial and gender segregation as well. And I really believe if anyone saw the congressional hearings on hate on the internet that happened, I think a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, it became evident to me watching those debates that if it's not younger people having those conversations, we are missing just huge swaths of of a technological age that, you know, for good or ill, many of us have aged out of. And so that investment in youth leadership, and not just the kids who go to, who join the student council, but the ones behind the building smoking the cigarettes, that those influencers are critically important in this moment.
Thank you, thank you. A couple of other questions are coming in. I'm going to try to combine a couple of them. It seems that that the anti-Semitism that you described goes hand in hand and is part and parcel of racism and other kinds of white nationalism and oppressions, and that it underscores, at least in America, underscores those traditions. So it would seem that fighting white supremacy and that level of anti-Semitism would be something that we should do in relationship with and in common cause with other oppressed communities and targeted groups from that side. Can you say something about the value of that and how we might go about enhancing those relationships?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is what's exactly right in that question is that we are in a moment where it is time to reconstruct a new civil rights movement that meets the challenges and also the opportunities of this time. I believe that because we are dealing both with systemic discrimination and a rise of a social movement of influence that's driven by anti-Semitism, that the Jewish community needs to be full partners in the development and the leadership of that coalition. Where I disagree is that it is the role of the Jewish community to simply be allies or supporters in that coalition. The Jewish community has skin in the game, part of the title of the essay that I wrote. And this means that this coalition can't merely be built off the basis of we're going to address these other issues and then we will get to anti-Semitism. It is that anti-Semitism is a part of the items of that civil rights table, along with other pieces. If I were to take that a step forward and to make that very tangible, one of the things that I would ask those on this call to think about are committing to hosting 2 events in 2021 in their congregation or in the organization they work in. One that looks and develops the understanding of your constituency around the history and present day reality of white supremacy and racial discrimination, and what the main policy issues are in these days that we should be aligning around. And also another workshop that deals and explains the rise of the white nationalist movement, right? And the role of anti-Semitism in driving that movement. As I pointed out earlier in this call, over 100 Americans have been murdered over the last 2 years. That's a very significant number, right? By white nationalists. The majority of those victims, right, were not Jewish.
Right.
A disproportionate percentage of that grouping of victims were. But the majority of folks who were killed were not Jewish. And they may have been attacked because they were Black or Latino or Muslim or immigrant. But we should be clear, they were killed because white nationalists believe they are in an existential fight with the Jewish community. That means anti-Semitism is killing all of us.
Yes, thank you. That was a very clear answer with a very specific ask that I think was very helpful, which actually in some ways leads to the next question, which is the last one we'll have time for today, which is, at the moment you're speaking to about 50 American rabbis. What role do you see, Eric, from your vantage point, for rabbis and cantors and clergy leaders in this conversation in the Jewish community?
Absolutely. So I would say beyond those two trainings, I just want to take a
excellent suggestions.
Thank you. And if there are ways we can be helpful, I know there are other organizations out there, but in ways we can be helpful. But let me give some very specific pieces. So for cantors, for rabbis, it's humbling to be on a call with 50 leaders. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I would offer this. Think about if you have not given yet a sermon or commentary on anti-Semitism within your congregation or within your organization. I hope you will commit to doing that, sometime in the next 2 to 3 months. It is useful and important for leaders to set the parameters and to open up space for that conversation. Again, we're happy to help. The other thing that might be considered that would have an amazing amount of impact is meeting with local, state, and federal elected officials, not around specific policy per se, right, but around your concern of the rising tide of anti-Semitism, and how elected officials have at times utilized that anti-Semitism to drive political narrative in our society, and that has come at a real cost, and it's not acceptable. And talking with elected officials from the local to the federal, to get them to commit to pledge not to do that in this next electoral cycle. That would have an incredible impact. And I'll just say this quickly, I know we're running out of time. The reason we know it is of significance is in 2000, on September 11th, I was working in Seattle for a human rights organization. By the time I had gotten to my office, someone had put a huge banner, anti-Muslim banner over a freeway, right? And someone had also stuffed a stick of dynamite under the gas line of a Jewish congregation in the city south of Seattle. These were the first two incidences of dozens of hate crimes that took place between September 11th and September 16th, including, as we know, across the country, several murders. Those hate crimes continued to rise and increase until George W. Bush, and John Ashcroft, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, went on the air, thanks to the work of the Anti-Defamation League and others, and said to the American public, hate crimes will not be tolerated, not even in the moment of national mourning and the terror that we feel. You will not target American Muslims, and if you do, you will be held accountable. There was a direct corresponding fall in the number of reported hate crimes after these two public officials spoke to the American public. So the role of elected officials and their voice right now is critically important in changing this narrative. And one thing you all can do is to influence them to take a pledge and to speak out publicly and to know it's a real concern.
Thank you, Eric. That is an awesome answer, and maybe something that our organizations can collectively work on to make happen. Thank you, Eric, for your time with us this afternoon. I'm now turning this back over to Ashira.
Hi, thank you so much, Elise, and thank you to our presenter today, Mr. Eric Ward, for all of your illuminating insights. Thank you also to our past speakers, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt and Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. A number of people came together today to plan and execute this series of phone calls, and they all
Is that
JCPA's David Bernstein, the RA's Jacob Blumenthal, CCR Rabbi Hara Person and Rabbi Betsy Torup, and as well as their manager of program, Eliza Orent. Thank you for giving the introduction today. Thank you to the RCA's Rabbi Mark Dratch, and thank you to Rabbi Elise Wexerman for doing the Q&A today. Also, among the Rabbinical Assembly staff, we owe a great debt of thanks to Diana Denza and Max Arad for handling the tech, and to Rabbi Lee Paskind, who was the silent organizer of all of this and made it all come together. Thank you so much, Lee. Recordings for all of these sessions will be sent out through the rabbinical organizations and through the JCPA. They'll also be posted to the Rabbinical Assembly's YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today and for the entire series.